I think we're going to go ahead anyway. We're on the record on camera, so this will be available on the web, which I think will be wonderful. We're going to start our panel, I think, with Ethel Lund, who's at the far end of the table. We've got Ethel Lund, Selena Everson, Marie Olson, and Nora Dauenhauer. They're all life members of the Alaska Native Sisterhood. And I know that Ethel and Selena have both served on, or are on the executive committee of the Grand Camp of the Alaska Native Sisterhood. And I asked them to talk about their life experiences with the organization. Many, I think probably all of them, went to sisterhood meetings with their mothers when they were young women, young children. And I'm just going to have Ethel start. There's a feedback issue with this mic, especially when we're right there. We'll have Ethel start, and she'll talk about her life experience with the Alaska Native Sisterhood.
Thank you, Kim. I feel very fortunate to have grown up and spent a childhood in a community, in a family that was nurtured by the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood. In the little town of Wrangell, it seemed our whole life centered around our A&B hall. At Christmas, there was a big Christmas tree. Everybody brought their presents there. We spent Christmas as a community in the A&B hall. There were potlucks every other week or so. All family members attended. And we learned how to dance with the broom dance. In other words, all of our social activity took place there. My grandmother told me the background of the Alaska Native Sisterhood and how it got started in Wrangell. And she wrote a report on this on their 75th anniversary of the organization, which took place in Wrangell in 1995. This is what she had written in regard to the history. She says, in the fall of 1914, in September or October, about 8 of us women met at Mrs. Louise Bradley's home. The women were Tilly Tamry, Eva Blake, Elizabeth Desmond, Louise Bradley, Jessie Reinhardt, Louise Kasunk, and Susie Yeg Cook. Those were the organizing women. She says, we asked Judge William Thomas to help us organize. He told us we needed a book of rules, which we began working on, and the following women were elected to office. President, Mrs. Eva Blake, Vice President, Louise Bradley, Secretary, Mrs. Josephine Ucas, who was my grandmother, and we had to have a name. Our first choice was Alaska Daughters Home League, and also the second name, the North Star. George Blake said, why don't you pick Alaska Native Sisterhood? Then it will be an auxiliary to an organization already organized in Wrangell. So the Alaska Native Sisterhood was being born to give a helping hand to our brothers in the A&B. We met from house to house. We took care of the old and the sick. We charged each member 25 cents, then 25 cents a month, $1 to join, and then we raised it to 50 cents a month and $2 to join. And she ends it by saying, now I am a life member of the Sisterhood. So I grew up with that history. The two areas that the Sisterhood focused on at that time were education and health care. And they had a committee called the Home Health Care. And they had the committee actually go into the homes to see that they were properly kept. tuberculosis was pretty rampant at that time, so they had a standard of cleanliness that they required their members to live up to. And I was thinking, can you imagine that happening today? Somebody coming into your home to see that it was properly clean. When I was in school, first, second, third, fourth grade, in public school, the A&S ladies used to come into our classroom very quietly, and they'd sit in the back of the classroom with their hats. They're cooking us. And us little Indian kids would feel so proud. And you could feel the atmosphere in the school change. They'd go to classroom to make sure that, and they talked with the teachers. So they kept a close eye on us as we were making our way through school. The A&B Hall in Wrangell was built in a style that was used in most of the halls. And that was before I was around, but they told me that the logs were towed in, the lumber was made, and they built the hall. The women supplied the food, and that's where we learned about Sisterhood stew. It's still used today. Whenever an activity requires food, a big pot of Sisterhood stew is made. And I think it's based on corned beef, canned corned beef, which was very inexpensive in those days. Yeah. And potatoes and carrots, onions, tomatoes, maybe some macaroni. Yeah. Really good. So in any camp, whenever there's a function, you'll have Sisterhood stew. To me, the organization is very important. I truly love the A&B and A&S because to me it represents the heart and soul of our people. Yesterday, one of the clan leaders spoke to an obligation that we have, but it isn't a harsh thing, obligation. It's just showing a respect for the organization. And the difference to me with the A&B and A&S is that the work is done all volunteer. When they went to convention, there was no per diem. You stayed with friends. People helped each other. And it was out of love and respect for the organization. And I think we still can learn from that devotion to a cause that really impacts your community and your family. The A&S, as I remember it and growing up too, was always raising money. They have bake sales. They used to call them rummage sales. Other forms of raising money too. And at convention, the main function of the A&S is also raising funds. And they turn the money over to the A&B. So they have the funds to travel to Washington, D.C. or wherever is needed to do the work that needs to be done. It was a relationship that seems to be becoming very threatened or rare now. And I think that we lose something when we don't give of ourselves to an organization that we love. So the A&S became known and is still known as the backbone of the A&B. And it just kind of reminds me of a story I heard. I think it illustrates the role of the A&S. The lady whose husband was scheduled to give a report or a speech at this function. So she washes his shirt, irons his shirt, helps him tie his tie, gives him ideas of what to say in his big speech, and sends him off with lots of words of encouragement. He comes home very excited, and she said, "How did it go?" He said, "It went well. I even got a standing ovation." And she asked, "What were you saying when you got that ovation?" He said, "I said, and in conclusion." So, in my mind, the ANS is providing the encouragement, the strength. The women were always handling the finances, and they were trusted and very strict. As I say, I feel very fortunate to have grown up when this organization was very much a part of our life. And I joined the ANS in 1969. And I think I've only missed about 4 conventions since then. So I'm really very grateful for this organization. And since this is the 100th year of the A&B, I hope you will consider joining if you're in your own community, and we can bring back the vitality and the energy that makes it such an advocate and a strong spokesman for our lives and for the children and our grandchildren. Thank you for being here and sharing this time with us. Thank you.
I'll gear my comments to what it meant to me growing up in an ANS and an A&B home in Angoon. Their pride in the organization was something to behold. But before I go any further, I'd like to recognize the widow of one of our very esteemed leaders, Patrick Paul. Irene is sitting up here, Irene Paul. I remember they were going to pose for an ANS picture. My mother said, they got haircuts, and their uniform was white, nurse's dress, and the colors, royal blue, for loyalty, and white, as pure as the driven snow in Alaska. These became the colors of the ANS. The A&B is gold and red. Gold for the gold in Alaska and the blood that was shed. The effect on me of their pride in the organizations has led me to where I am today. My mother said to me, she said, with love and respect to the organization, you'll walk before the sisters and the brothers. Those words have brought me here today. Their pride in the organization had such an effect on me. And some of the ladies, my mentors, the late Stella Martin, Bessie Vasaya, Mabel Johnson Zuboff, Lily Hamburg, Lily George and Emma Hamburg, Cyril's mother and aunt, how they used to meet They even had a word for amendment, a tuchtagtjia kwati. They conducted their meetings in Tlingit. And my mother became president. She spoke very, if any, English at all. But with their pride in the ANS and the ANB, Angoon was so active when the organization first started. The 100th year of the ANS is coming up pretty soon, I think in about 15 years. But while we're here, Ethel and I have attended many conventions together. We didn't get into mischief, though. We were nice girls. I mentioned my mentors, but in my mind was always my mother's words to me. With love and respect, you walk before them. My father, my uncles, my aunties, my grandmas were all ANS members in Angoon. They were so proud of the AMB Hall in Angoon that they all contributed their own skills. And my mother used to tell me, your uncles both used to come and go up and get the logs that they sawed and that they worked on to build the hall. I get very emotional sometimes when I think back on these beautiful women and the men that loved the organization. They gave their whole lives. I became an ANS junior member in Angoon. I started attending conventions in 1983, and I don't think I've missed a convention since then. I became Grand Secretary and served 5 years, but to this day, I don't know how to use a computer. We were old-time typewriters. My father was so proud he went to buy me a little typewriter. And you know, with the pride in the organization, my mother said, you're going into the Western world. I didn't know. She didn't teach me how to put up our food that we love to this day. That's in our taste buds. She didn't teach me how to weave basket. Her basket is in the museum, along with some artifacts from Angoon. I think I have grown through my role in the Sisterhood. In Sitka, in the 70s, my husband and I was in the auxiliary for American Legion, and I had to say a few little words, and believe me, my whole body was shaking. I stood there and almost collapsed. First time I addressed an audience. And I give all the credit to Alaska Native Sisterhood that I now can speak with so much pride and love for our beautiful two organizations. It's the 100th birthday is coming up. It'll be held here October 3rd. And I was going to call the president of Anchorage Camp, Marvin Adams from Yakutat. They're planning a big kickoff of the celebration with a big parade in Anchorage, 29th, 30th, and 31st in Anchorage, involving all the organizations. And he has written a grant to support this movement. And hopefully I didn't do wrong by telling. I think it's Marvin's right to make the announcement. He said, we'll invite all the organizations, all the Native organizations. And the corporations in Anchorage have already offered to help. money-wise. And I remember the men like Frank Price, Peter Simpson, Patrick Paul, Cyrus Peck. There's so many of them. Peratrovich, the two brothers, and Patrick. I became Grand Secretary in 1983. My first time I was going to write, I couldn't. I was so nervous. I had so much pride in this organization. I felt I was not qualified to be their secretary of the Alaska Native Sisterhood. But the words from my mother comes back to me all the time. I remember the first conference, women's conference in Juneau. I repeated these words. And when I think about it, believe me, it stays in my heart. And when I repeat what my mother said, and their pride in this organization, we are now in need of new members. And the celebration that will be held here in Sitka, October 3rd, I believe it starts, is going to be something to be celebrated statewide. The AMB has a big name. The Alaska Native Sisterhood followed. And in conclusion, I would just like to thank Sister Kimberly, Kim Metcalfe, and her brother. I knew her mother and her father. They loved the Native people exhibited by these two Metcalfe children. I remember their dad, Peter Metcalfe. No, Vern Metcalfe. When your memory starts going, believe me, it goes. And I'm supposed to be quiet now, but you know what? I keep talking because I think I forgot something. I know I did. Bessie Visaya, with her humor, she fined herself $50. She said, I probably won't be back to convention because she's up in years. And lo and behold, here's Bessie Visaya again. Then she got up, she said, I fined myself $50 for being back. I thought I was going to be gone by now. So the humor of the Alaska Native Sisterhood and Brotherhood, the Grand March led always by Cyrus Peck from Angoon. And one time Ethel was a leader with Alfredo. And we have to form our kugenas would come down on our shoulders. And sometimes the guys used to kind of pull on it so it would come down. But we have such fond, precious memories, the humor of our elders, the stories that they have told about ANS. I think my mind is going blank. It comes with age. So I'll turn it over to Sister Marie. Here.
Good afternoon. I'm Nora Dauenhauer, and I think you all know me, so I won't go into my genealogy and all that. Anyway, my experience as I was growing up on the ANS was we didn't have much of anything, no money, very little if we had any. We were fishermen, berry pickers, smoked salmon makers, a taishi, the dry fish, and deer meat, smoking deer meat. for winter. So this is how we saved money. What we didn't have to spend on groceries, we saved for important things like a donation to something that was very important to all of us. At one point, in fact, I asked my uncle, my father's nephew, what is the limit on donation money? And I thought he was going to say $10 or something like that. He said, $1. If everybody brings $1, it adds up. So that's what we donated, was $1 each. And another way of raising money was volunteer work. Men would volunteer the heavy work that had to be done. And women would volunteer all kinds of ways, like cooking, etc. So, in fact, one point that I remember was when Austin came to Juneau to visit us. My Auntie Jenny, I'm wearing her hat. She's no longer with us, and her kugana. But Austin Hammond came to see his mother, Jenny Marks, and my uncle. And he heard there was the log cabin that was A&B Hall was there, and they needed the foundation posts need to be dug, the holes for the foundation. And Austin went over there, took his coat off, and started digging. This is the kind of volunteer work everybody did. Not only Austin, but he's an example, so I thought I better mention it. This was my experience about growing up among people who were A and B, A and S. And the women volunteered to do anything that was women's work. Cooking, baking, etc. Another time I remember is that my Uncle Jim, I remember we didn't have money either at that time. But A and B needed money for that log cabin. I'm not sure what for. I didn't pay that much close attention. But so he did the traditional way. I remember that they didn't do much of traditional ways, but he did. He took all of his ado to the A&B Hall and started to donate money on each piece for the A&B Hall. And of course, knowing things they all followed. Remember last night when people were donating money, that was how it was. They donated money. They followed Jim in donating on the ado. And some of them ran home and got their ado and donated on that too. So although we were being told that we're no longer Tlingits, or we couldn't speak Tlingit, my family kept on talking Tlingit and kept on going the Tlingit way. They were too busy to stop. We had to keep living. And things that were done by hand and gathered by hand were what we did. I'm sure there was other people who did the same and didn't listen to the folks that were telling us not to talk Tlingit. And when I went to school, one of the ways that I remember school was I drew a big apple on a piece of paper. We were given these papers. And, well, I was very proud of it. And one of my buddies, I couldn't speak English, you know. All I could do is mumble, sing it a lot. Anyway, my friend just grabbed my hair and banged my head on the apple. Of course I cried. I don't know what was going on. Anyway, this is my experience at growing up among A and S, A and B. The Huna people, where my father came from, would stop there. There were two houses that they had. My uncle had the Brown Bear house, and the other was Brown Bear Nest House, which we stayed in. And we went and I'm sorry, it is hard for me to do this. Thank you. Anyway, I think I'll stop here. Gonna cheers for listening. It was a grand time growing up. Being poor isn't bad, not among Tlingit people. They would for next door. They'd cook something huge and they'd pass it to the next door. We still do that. We pass dishes to the people that are living near us. So that's my experience. $1 was the limit for donation.
Almost everything that you'll hear is absolutely true. We talk about doing volunteer work. That's what we do. We support the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and we did right from the beginning. Our mothers worked very hard because they knew what the brothers were doing. And that was just about the time the Tlingit and Haida land claims was working. They saved their quarters. At that time, a quarter meant a lot. My friend, Ellen Hope, used to talk about her mother putting a bunch of quarters in the corner of her handkerchief. And when it came time for donating it, her mother would open up her handkerchief and dole out 2 of them and putting it in the pot. Those were our parents. We all have a history. What Ethel is talking about is the birth of the Alaska Native Sisterhood. In Wrangell, there was that number 1 camp. That's very prestigious. And what I'm talking about and will be talking about is camp number 2. And to me, camp number 2, which is in Juneau, is very prestigious. I was gone from Alaska for quite a few years, maybe something like 45 years. And when I finally came home, that was 1972. And the following year, 1973, I got a telephone call from my aunt, Emma Olson. Her last name is spelled with an E, by the way. And she always reminded me of that because my name is Olson as well. My last name is spelled with an O. She never let me forget that. If it were not for my Aunt Emma, I would not have been enrolled in the Alaska Native Sisterhood. It wasn't a year after I got to town. She called me up and she says, "Come on down to the A&B hall." She said, "I'm running for office." I went down there and she had a card for me, already signed up. And she said, "The dues are $6 a year." And she said, "I'm running for office and you're going to vote for me." And that's the way it was every year. I didn't get involved with the Camp 2 until probably 1994, when I went down there and my Aunt Emma needed help. She said, "You're going to run for office." I said, "I don't know what's happening." I said, "I don't know what you're doing." She said, "That's all right." She said, "I'll teach you." And she taught me very well. She said, "I'm going to be secretary." And it wasn't just taking notes. It wasn't just taking notes at every meeting, but I had to write her speeches too. Whenever she ran for office, I wrote her speeches and she always won. But she was not just a kind, loving aunt outside of the camp too. She was a slave driver. I learned very well. I ran after that for every office except Sergeant at Arms, but I did that too. I didn't run for the camp council. I think I'm ready for that. But recording secretary, I was Aunt Emma's recording secretary for several years. And then I thought I could do the financial secretary. And that was collecting dues. And I don't know if I really pleased her or not, but as a financial secretary, what you do is to collect the dues. Well, I went further. We were listening. The brothers and ourselves were listening to candidates for the assembly. And there was a young man there, and the brother said that they had to join the AMB, and he said, "What do you do?" I put my hand out. I said, "You pay dues to ANS." Mark Wheeler joined the Alaska Native Sisterhood. He was the first male to join the Alaska Native Sisterhood. That opened the door to Judge Peter Freilich and Mayor Bruce Botello. There was another person, another male, but that's what I did as financial secretary. Then I ran for office, for presidents. And I forgot who the opponent was, but I won. And I learned the organization of the Alaska Native Brotherhood because I had to. If the sisters were going to work with the brothers, you had to know what they were doing. And that meant studying their constitution. And that meant also studying parliamentary procedure. And I was learning on the job, learning parliamentary procedure on the job as president for Alaska Native Sisterhood Camp 2. And whenever I got into a bind on some issue, I called the Grant Camp's parliamentarian, and that was your grandpa, John Hope. I called him up whenever an issue came up. I said, "This motion was made." He said, "You can't do that. That's not a legal motion. You have to put that motion out of order because a motion that is negative is not legal." So I almost got run out of Camp 2 because I put that motion out of order. But before I did that, I said, "John Hope said that was an illegal motion." That protected me. I enjoyed a lot of camaraderie on both sides, the male and the female, and especially when the Grant Camp had their elections, and the end of the elections, they had a huge banquet with tablecloths and beautiful table settings, cloth napkins, flowers, and everyone was dressed. And if the men could get tuxedos, I think they would have, but they were all suited up, and the women wore long gowns. I had never owned a long gown, but since I joined ANS Camp 2, I now have 3 hanging in my closet because it is a formal affair, a beautiful formal affair. At the end, they had what you call a grand march, and the musicians were all native. Tommy Jimmy, with his saxophone, playing, what was that? Oh, When the Saints Go Marching In. Man, that was a lot of fun. And they did all kinds of maneuvers. You know, sometimes 2x2, 3x3, 4x4, and 6. And pretty soon the whole hall was just covered with people, all dancing to When the Saints Go Marching In. So it was a lot of work. And volunteer work. Doing volunteer work is what I call a labor of love, you're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it for the organization because you love the organization. And that's what all of the members do. I read a lot of written works about the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and when your grandpa finished Ishmael finished the book, I read that cover to cover. How they discussed the issue. And there must have been a lot of yelling and screaming and pounding the table and stomping on the floor. But when they got through, they walked out of the hallway arm in arm and laughing and saying, "Boy, you sure put up a good fight." That's what AMB is about, debate. And reading about the founding fathers, the issues that they went back to discuss in Washington, D.C., to me was very important. That was freedom of education for their children. For their children. And I appreciate that part especially. And the other one was workmen's compensation. This morning they were talking about AMB getting involved with unions, and I heard one person say that the reason they couldn't get going was because the AMB was getting involved in the Clinton-Haida land claims. But the years that they were talking about was 1935, and if you think back in your history or read the history of the United States, 1935 was when the National Labor Relations Act came into being, and that meant we had, the working people had the right to organize. 1935 or 1936, my stepfather was involved in Juneau in a strike of the mine workers. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that because he was going to strike to get more pay. I'm not sure exactly how much money they made, but apparently when they got through with the strike, there were no injuries. Maybe somebody got a bump on the head because I saw him whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a club. So maybe somebody got hit. And then my mother as a cannery worker, she got involved in getting more pay for the women. And we as children, I was 9 years old and I had to babysit. And to me that was okay. That was okay because my mother was working and then my older sister was working. We all worked before, and it didn't bother us. Nobody came after us because we all were working for the family. We're all working for the family. I enjoy being in the Alaska Native Sisterhood. I think I saw Priscilla come in. Priscilla is Priscilla Coons. Oh, okay, she's not here. Well, Priscilla Coons now is the holding force inside Alaska Native Sisterhood Camp 2. And I've got my dues paid up. So I was hoping maybe Priscilla would come and join us. Oh, there's one thing that's very interesting before I get off the microphone, but every one of us up here, Ethel, Selena, Kim, Nora, myself, we are all members of the awareness program called Women of Distinction. Yeah. Thank you very much. Ganaz cheese.
And what a distinguished panel of women they are. So please give them another big round of applause. I'm just want to say, to wrap it up, that I am so proud to be part of the organization and to have gotten to know these women better. Thank you, Selena, for mentioning my parents. My father, Vern Metcalfe, as many of you remember, was a very gregarious man. He loved people, and he didn't care what color they were or what they did for a living. He just liked them, and he really opened the door for my brother Peter and I and all my siblings to the Native community. In those days, it wasn't considered popular to hang out with Native people, but he did, and he liked them, and we're just, both of our lives have been so enriched by getting to know the Native community, and especially I'm just so proud to be part of the Alaska Native Sisterhood. Marie invited me to join Camp 2, and her aunt, Emma Olson, gave me a white dress to wear at Camp 2 formal functions. Dolores Cadianti, I see Barbara in the audience, was very welcoming, and she let me know that the Alaska Native Sisterhood was a colorblind institution. I certainly appreciated that. I mean, all the leaders, Cecilia Coons, I didn't know Bessie Visaya, but reading about her and listening to an interview with her that's included in the book, I mean, these were powerful women. And the stories about them collecting quarters and $50, dollar bills, I mean, they were the force behind the Alaska Native Brotherhood. They were the backbone. They still are, especially when it came to fundraising. It's an amazing organization, and I don't know, did you have something else you wanted to say, Selena, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would like to.
Let's just get one more round.
Just to say one more round for the musicians of the village. Man, they were great. Some of them couldn't read, but they learned how to read music. If they did, I don't know. They sounded great, though. And then the musicians played for dances, which was a lot of fun. And I came on the scene when Jitterbug was coming, so I had a great time.
We all love the ANS, but there's so much humor. I remember Ketchikan Convention. A gentleman asked, "Have you seen my wife?" "Oh, she's over there sitting with all the virgins," because we all wear white. End of my story.
we all have our stories, no kidding. I've never seen women laugh at some things that, to me, ordinarily would not be laughable, but we do a lot of laughing.
Okay, so question, Lee, Florindo. Use the mic so they can pick it up. Use the mic because they want to pick it up for the camera. Come on.
When we were growing up, I remember Mom making some fancy sandwiches for something that was going on for A&B or A&S. And when she was done, we could eat the crust because she cut the crust off. And I never saw anything so fancy. She would lay a wet towel over the bread so that it wouldn't dry out before the party. But those fancy sandwiches always went to an A&S activity. And just recently, I suggested that we have tea in our department at Tlingit and Haida. I said, let's make some Sisterhood sandwiches. And some of them didn't know what I was talking about. I had to describe them. But we got to eat the crust, and sometimes it had egg salad on it. What were those for, anyway?
We never got to go. Well, I heard them talk about box lunches. Maybe that's what it was for. They'd sell those box lunches and to the highest bidders, and I'm sure that was really a fun event. Any other questions for the ladies? Well, if not, I think we're going to wrap it up, and if you would give one more big round of applause to this wonderful group of women.